Hello, and thanks for joining me at another edition at Let's Talk with Marcel. Today, I have a fabulous entertainer, blues guitarist from Chicago. This gentleman has been all over the world. He started way back when he was a little tyke. I'm going to find out all about that. And then I'm going to tell you about some of the other things that he's done, because he's been an entrepreneur, restaurant owner. This is what musicians do. But I want to tell you, as a guitarist, I call him the Crying Guitarist, because he is so amazing in the way that he makes that guitar cry out, singing. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce Tom Crivellone. Tommy,
hey,
let's talk.
Let's talk.
How you doing, buddy?
Great, man.
Welcome to the show.
Great. Happy to. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, this is great. You know, you're a Chicago blues guitarist, and that's a unique definition. Can you tell me, like, how did this all start for you?
I started playing guitar, again as an growth of watching Beatles on TV and all that stuff, and I just loved it. And the first thing I did was actually when we had school skits, very much like a show and tell, but I was 9 years old, and none of us had guitars. The drummer had an actual set of drums, and so we actually pantomimed the Beatles using large cutouts of guitars.
Now, how old were you at this?
That was about 10 at that time.
You were 10. And
Yeah.
do you know the Beatles song that you pantomimed?
Oh yeah, we did. From the first album, we did "I Want to Hold Your Hand," and we did. I think "Saw Her Standing There." The first two we did.
Yeah.
Ironically, in my career, I haven't played that much Beatles, but that was the thing for me, and all the girls liked it. And from that point on, I begged my mom and dad to buy me a guitar, and they made me first learn how to play on acoustic to make sure I would go to lessons. And then I got my first electric guitar when I was, that was 11 and a half or something like that.
Wow.
So I started loving blues a long time ago, actually through rock artists. The first time I even had an awareness of Chicago blues is when I was in Chicago as a young boy, and the Rolling Stones were coming to pay homage to Chess Records and Muddy Waters. And so I really didn't understand how the whole thing worked, but as I started to play guitar, more and more the music that I played and I heard had some sort of blues influence in it, just like much of rock and roll has blues influence. So as I got older, that kind of blues influence, kind of shaped which rock and roll artists I like to sound like, and some of my great heroes, consequently. And like guys like Eric Clapton and John Mayall and Jeff Beck and Carlos Santana. Those were guys on the rock side that, to me, brought the blues really to life initially. And it wasn't until I actually saw B.B. King live when I was 16 years old. I just had a car, and I was making money, and I went out to see, B.B. King at the Auditorium Theater in Chicago, which is like the Stanford Palace, or just wonderful, regal-looking old theater, and he had a 15-piece band, man, and I was hooked.
So now, where were you living at that time?
Chicago, yeah.
So,
Yeah.
you were born and raised in Chicago.
Born and raised in Chicago on the south side.
South side, okay. South side of Chicago.
South side.
I think there's a song that has that in there, Leroy Brown, right?
Yes, well, actually,
The bad,
Big Bad Leroy Brown,
Yeah.
baddest man, right. Yeah, no, that is allegedly written about one of the first cool guys I met in a blues club in Chicago,
And who was that?
much later, Leroy Brown.
Okay.
And, Jim Croce allegedly, and I'm pretty sure it was, met this guy who was 6'5", very affable, very fine dresser. Let's say he had a checkerboard patchwork of careers, which included, dealing drugs and making women available, and but on the other hand, he was just the really nicest, most respectful guy you'd want to meet. And I met him at 4 o'clock in the morning at Kingston Mines, which is one of the venerable old-time blues clubs in Chicago. And what a nice gentleman. But until years later, when I'd heard the story that was originally Jim Croce had him in mind when he wrote the song.
Wow. Now, you started to talk about you meeting B.B. King.
It was the Auditorium Theater. I had a girlfriend from grade school.
Okay.
And I was working construction, if you could believe it, in the summers, even at 16 years old. And I had a car, so I called Karen, my girlfriend, who had been my girlfriend in like 3rd grade, and I asked her out on a date. And so I was looking for tickets, and my father, who worked in the city of Chicago, he said, well, I called the ticket broker, and B.B. King's available. And at that time, Thrill Is Gone was out on the radio, and that was pop radio tune. It was probably top 20 at the time. And I said, let's go see B.B. King. And, you know, again, we had a really wonderful date, except for the fact that once the music started, I kind of didn't even know she was there. So, I mean, you know, and again, I know your musical background, but just imagine, here's this 15-piece orchestra, which I had really never heard. I had heard some of the classic singers, you know, like Vic Damone and Frank Sinatra by that time, but to have that electric power along with those horns and the big baritone sax, and you know, it was mesmerizing, and I just couldn't get enough of it, and from that point on, I started really trying to consume that music, you know, everything from, you know, West Side clubs, you know, very, very skeletal blues, raw, raunchy blues, to more of that big band stuff, like, you know, Joe Williams' great version of, you know, that crosses jazz and blues of Let the Good Times Roll, you know.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah. So what was it like growing up in the south side of Chicago when you were a kid?
Well, Marcel, what it was like growing in the south side of Chicago was kind of like the divisiveness that we have today. You know, by the time I was 6, you know, the white flight had begun, and I was packed off to my grandma's during the week to go to school in Oak Park, which is like a border town on the west side of Chicago. And so we went from where I grew up as a young man, okay, and where eventually all the music I loved came from. I had this kind of like otherworldly experience, almost like going to boarding school 5 days a week, and I'd go home to my south side home on the weekends. And when I realized culturally what that meant to music in the city of Chicago, I was already in high school, and we had moved from there. So, you know, it gives you street cred to say you grew up in the south side when you play blues in Chicago. And but really my experience of it as an older person is really where I really understood what happened, you know. I mean, I could tell you the wonderful, wonderful clubs, small clubs.
Tell me.
Well, there was a great club on 87th Street, I believe it was Lee's Unleaded. And Lee's Unleaded had what we call Southside Blues. Southside Blues had more soul crossover into it. So you would see, you know, fancy people dressed up, where you would see, you know, blues artists who also had soul hits, you know, like, I mean, there's so many of them. But I'm trying to think of Bobby, Can I Change My Mind? You know that song? Baby,
Yeah.
Can I Change My Mind? You know, just so many artists like that. And I never saw them. I heard the records. And you know, as I got older and I started playing blues seriously, in fact, one of my first serious blues bands in Chicago was when I moved back there as an older guy. And it was Mr. L.C. Walker, my first partner.
Okay.
Took me to all those clubs that I had only heard about as a kid, and it was just a wonderful experience. There was a guy by the name of Lattimore, which you know, Lattimore had written a lot of songs. One of them was "Straighten It Out," which had a reprise about 10 years ago because an modern R&B artist played it, and you know, it was just really cool. I mean, I could go on and on. You know, Little Johnny Taylor, who wasn't from Chicago, but that's the kind of music. Now, Little Johnny Taylor, everyone knows from the soul hit, Who's Making Love with Your Old Lady, you know, while you were out making love. Okay, that song, he was actually a blues artist, and he did, you know, so many other tunes that was, that were interesting and rhythmic and really much different than a lot of people out here understand blues to be, and that's why it's always wonderful to find a kindred spirit when I when I go out to a club,
Right. So I'm trying to figure out here the transition between your high school years and then the restaurant owning.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, first of all, it would drive you crazy if I told you, man, but I'll try to make it brief. I tried desperately, I had middle-class upbringings, and, like the line in The Godfather, my parents always thought Senator Crivellone, President Crivellone. And so, I felt so much pressure to go to traditional school, college. I got a business degree. And ironically, I met my wife while we were at the business, while we were at the University of Illinois together. But while I was down there to make money, I started playing in 50s and 60s bands, if you could believe that. So 4 years of pretty serious 50s and 60s band, private parties, actually fairly large venues, because that was popular. Again, go back to Woodstock, where you saw Sha-Na-Na doing those kind of crossovers. So when I moved back to Chicago after college, there wasn't that kind of nexus there that I could play with. So I did like every guy does. I did the weekend warrior thing, playing private parties and small bars and variety music, where on one stage we might play Journey, and then I would go into a blues tune. Okay, so that was it. And as I got older and I had kids, I just literally stopped playing. And it was kind of like every musician that we've probably run across, was difficult for me. And my wife got a transfer opportunity. She worked for a company that Swiss Bank, which is now UBS in Manhattan and Stanford. They purchased the company she was working with. So I actually moved to Connecticut before I got serious about blues, if you could believe that. So here I come to a place where there isn't that much live blues, but I started playing the music that I always loved. And I would go, I met a friend of mine, dear friend, who owned a stained glass business in Devon, Ray Tuccio, and he brought me to Cafe 9 to a jam there and I met guys who liked the kind of music that I liked. And I saw Hubert Sumlin there and a lot of other really good Chicago blues artists. So it's like, they say, sometimes you have to go away to find where your home is, and that's what I did.
So you, Cafe 9 in New Haven, Connecticut.
Cafe 9 in New Haven.
And which is a lot of musicians, it used to be called the Musicians Lounge or Living Room.
Musicians Living Room,
Right.
Absolutely.
So people would meet up there and have different jam sessions, and they still do.
They still do. A little minimized compared to the old days, but it's still fun. The blues sessions are once a month, still on Sundays, and was there a few weeks ago. That's where we met. We met a second time. Yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So, how did you get into the restaurant business?
Okay, that's another good one. Okay, so when I was a little kid, my aunt had a restaurant, and I loved nothing more than to go over there and make sodas and mess around. So when I was away at college, they talked about opening up another restaurant, and quite frankly, we at that point, since again, Italian family, I was the first guy in my family to finish college. Okay, and I'm talking about on my mother's side and my father's side.
That's an accomplishment.
That's an accomplishment. And so since I was the designated, a business guy, because I got a business degree, not an accounting degree, my cousins, two of my cousins roped me in, and that's the way my wife describes it anyway.
Okay.
And I wasn't, at that point, I wasn't playing music, and quite frankly, if you know anyone who was in the restaurant business, there's an element of creativity and immediate response that after years of talking to myself about why I did it, I realized that it was to replace the performance thing, because being in the restaurant business it's a performance. And so I enjoyed my time in it. We made some money and we lost some money. And when my wife got this great transfer opportunity, we were at the point where, I had felt we had outgrown the place we were in, and I basically just handed my keys to my cousin, who was the remaining cousin, who was my partner, and I said, I'm going to Connecticut.
Now, do they still own the restaurant?
But no, I sold it in 2006.
Okay.
Yeah. So, strangely enough, and I don't know how much time we have in this format, but it was the key that got me going, because my remaining partner passed away in the restaurant, and my wife got a transfer opportunity. Another company hired her to come back to the Midwest, coincidentally, not because of or anything like that. And she turned to me, and anyone who's in the arts business knows it's kind of a difficult thing with your family life, because it's probably the closest thing to a mistress that most people's spouses have to endure. And she said, you always wanted to. We're doing okay. Why don't you try to see if you could play music full time? And that's when, along with my daughter, who lives in Chicago, my oldest daughter, we started hitting a blues club, because she lived very close to them. And I started meeting people and going to jam sessions, which is just the way you meet personnel. And there were many of them at the time in Chicago, 3 and 4 a night sometimes. And I met, actually many of the people that I still play with today.
Wow, that's so. You were in the restaurant in Chicago.
Yep.
And then
Chicago suburb.
And then your wife transferred here to Connecticut.
I started again playing seriously again out here, but after my partner in the restaurant passed away, simultaneously she got an opportunity to move back here, and so we moved back to Chicago in 2001. Okay. So right in the middle of what we were trying to figure out to do, all of a sudden the phone rings. And my wife gets this call. It was like it happened. She said, how'd you like to move to Chicago and back to Chicago? And so that began my more serious
So now you go back to Chicago.
Yep.
Clean up the whole restaurant thing, sell the thing out.
No, it's not so linear. Listen to this, man.
Okay.
We would go ahead. I would work there during the day, and I would make my chef clothes. And after dinner rush, 8 o'clock, I'd take off my restaurant guy clothes. Although being an Italian in a restaurant that has pizza, they weren't too different from the traditional camp shirt blues garb.
Okay.
But I would head downtown. Okay, near North was really the later clubs. There were 2 of them that were open till 4 a.m. at the time.
Okay.
And so I'd get down there 9 or 10 o'clock and starting to see who I could sit in with or who I could listen to learn my craft.
Right, okay. Huh?
And that's how I met, the guys in my band in Chicago, 2 for the Blues, in that same fashion. I met L.C. Walker, my first serious attempt, and the CD, we did a little demo CD that's, I'll say it's iTunes and CD Baby available. And and I also met a fella who eventually played in the Eddie Clearwater band, and when they needed some personnel changes, hired me to go on the road.
Okay, now, so that comes back to one of the reasons that you're on my show today, because you were the guitarist for the Eddie Clearwater band.
Yep.
Now, Eddie Clearwater, fabulous Chicago blues guitarist. He started off as a dishwasher.
Started out as a dishwasher, and he's got a song called "Came Up the Hard Way," and he did. He really did. Came to Chicago with, I think he was 14 or 15 when he came to Chicago. And he started as a dishwasher, and when he got a driver's license, he drove a cab. I mean, one of those stories.
Right, exactly.
And
pure musician story. Now, this is in the 50s and 60s.
Right.
Now, he got dubbed the Chief, Eddie the Chief Clearwater.
That's a great story on its own.
Right, tell me about that.
Well, there was Eddie who had started out as a sideman. In fact, a great YouTube video, you could see Eddie with Junior Wells, very young Eddie, in Poland, okay? And when he's playing guitar as a sideman. Well, as he started playing, he got notoriety, but he just didn't have the zing. So he got a manager. A manager said, Eddie, you need a nickname. And naturally, Muddy Waters was the biggest guy in Chicago and a personal friend of Eddie's. And he said, let's call you Clearwaters, okay? And he goes, man, Clearwater just sounds like an Indian name. He goes, well, Eddie was part Indian. It was like 25% Indian. And so that's where it began. And, you know, again, he wasn't a chief, okay, but that's what started his nickname everywhere. They would call him the Chief. So he started wearing a headdress as a show opener. And the culmination of that was there's a promoter still active today, Bob Claren, who had the first Pennsylvania Blues Festival. I don't know if it was called Pocono Blues Fest or Pennsylvania. And so they concocted a situation where Eddie would ride on the stage on a white horse with the headdress on and then come off and start singing. And from that point on, he became Eddie the Chief Clearwater.
So I want to show a clip of some of Eddie.
Mm-hmm.
So there's going to clip right now here, okay?
I guess I'm blue. One of my songs called I Came Up the Hard Way.
love this story of you and Eddie getting together. Can you tell me how you got together with him?
Well, what I mentioned, I had met one of the guys who eventually, in Chicago, and I'm sure in New York it's the same way, but there are people that travel there to study blues music. And one of the guys is a fellow by the name of Shoji Naito. He's becoming famous in his own right now. And he worked, music school graduate, in order to get a job with a bluesman. Well, I had known Shoji, had used him as a bass player, and unbeknownst to me, a suburban club that was owned by a serious blues club owner from Chicago needed help, so we started doing a weekly jam session there. And I met a lot of people, and Shoji came in and came out, and then he was gone for a while, and it turns out he got a job with Eddie. And it was a really great time in Eddie's career, because he really was starting to build again. And Eddie came in to the club one Monday night during our opening set, and afterwards he goes, "Man, I like the way you play." And Eddie was this great, you see him in the clip, he's got this great big smile, and I said, "Well, thanks." He goes, "Can you travel?" And I said, "Sure can, Eddie, where we're going." And he goes, I'll talk to you about it." And then 2 months later, maybe it was a test gig, I don't know, but we had a couple of gigs in Iowa. Actually at the place where they hold the Iowa caucus was one of them. And the rest of it was, pretty much history. And, I played an important function in the band. He had co-produced an album called West Side Strut. And it was an album with Ronnie Baker Brooks, who has that kind of rock edge guitar. And I was one of the guys, I brought that to the table, as well as traditional blues. So that was my function as the band is, in supporting that album, I was Ronnie. And just like some female vocalists might bring the counterpoint male vocalist for the duet, that was me initially. And then, after one mini tour, then I became permanent. And, Eddie at that point was already in his 70s. So it was a schedule that I could keep, and still have a family, and just a wonderful ride.
How many years did you?
10.
10.
Yeah, it was 10 years for my first gig.
Wow.
Yeah.
And you traveled all over the world.
Right. Yeah. Eddie had, he's Blues Hall of Fame, International Blues Hall of Fame.
Grammy nominated.
Grammy nominated, right, for one of his CDs, Rock and Roll City, actually. And what happens is you go through that process, and he waited his turn, so to speak, and all of a sudden the spotlight shone on him, and it was a great time to be with him because of his health issues in his 70s. We played, we go out 9 or 10 dates, and then we'd come back and rest for a while. So it was actually an okay schedule for me, and again, in Europe, like you probably hear this from jazz musicians and blues musicians, Europeans and European audiences are very appreciative of American product. For that matter, even the Soviet bloc countries are. I didn't, personally play in Poland or Russia, but from the blues people that I know that have gone over there, it's a great thing. And they do research. They know who you are before you get there. Even the guys who don't have as much notoriety. So it was beautiful.
Wow. So you have a lot of stories.
I do.
Road
I
stories.
probably could fill an hour-and-a-half program.
You have a lot of stories. But I have a guitar. So I want to ask you, can you just show us some blues chords?
Sure.
All right, I got a guitar over here. Here we go. Just happen to have a guitar.
Just happen to have a guitar.
Yeah. And so just show us like the concept of blues is 12 bars.
12 bars and 16 bars, but simple, right.
Okay. Now, what chords do you really mostly play?
Well, that's a good example. And again, the kind of blues that you play really affects your choices in voicing. Guitar is an instrument that has all kinds of voicings on it. This is a G, this is a G, but it doesn't sound hard enough for most blues music. So you might play a G7th, and that still sounds a little cowboy. But in blues guitar, you'll play a lot of this, okay? You know, and then you'll also chug the rhythm, you know, with a G7, like. And then you add a little bit, you know,
And that's still just all G7 chord.
that's all basically all built around the G7. You know, you know, add a little of this and take off a little of that, and you know, you get the ninth note. You know, I don't want to get too deep in the theory of it, but there is theory of it. You know, and that's kind of another misleading thing. It is mostly 3 or 4 chords, the songs, and there's not a lot of variability in the actual music. But you know, what I call it, it's like the saline solution for message. You know, and that's why if you notice, there's so many commercials that use blues music and classic rock that's influenced by blues music as the background. You know, and you know, it's and you could hear it all over the place. You know, the Beatles, going back to the G7. Well, let's go back to the 60s. Okay, that's actually a 16th. You know, Sam the Sham and the Pharaohs from the 60s, same G7th chord, but it didn't sound like blues. You know, Beach Boys, you know, doesn't sound like blues. But the rhythm and the chording and the voice and the guitar is really what makes, you know, the element of the blues. And the relationship between the percussion and the bass, and that's what really, really makes it so intertwined, and why people, even though on the surface might not be familiar with or say they don't really think they like blues music, when they go to a blues show, they have that kind of thing, you know. But it's, again, very, very, very big nuance. Like, for example, can I play a song? Okay.
A little bit, yeah, sure.
All right. There's originally a blues song, Teeny Weeny Bit, okay? Teeny Weeny Bit was released by Elvis, was released by Pat Boone. It was really a blues song, you know, which is a, right? Now that's where it departs when you have blues. When you go to the blues version, they'll be doing like a double time rhythm on it. You don't find that in Elvis, okay? You know, he'll go, you know, I don't want much, I just want a little bit. And that kind of hammer-on thing is characteristic of rock and roll, as opposed to the... So you just turn the corner a little bit and take it to Chicago or Memphis, and you have blues, you know.
Good. So we're going to have you play for us.
Sure.
And you're going to do one of your original tunes?
Sure.
Okay. And what is that original tune that you're going to do?
You know, I think probably I'll do Back to the City. It's a song I wrote with Mr. L.C. Walker, and it's really, I wrote it here, co-written with my friend Ray Tuccio, and it's about knowing that maybe you need to go back home.
Okay, that's cool.
In Chicago, where the blues are king. I've been around the world, but I know one thing. I gotta get out of Chicago, back to some place where I belong. Went to Miami, got a house by the sea. Riches, canes, and Cadillacs, they got the best of me. Gotta get out of Miami, back to a place where I belong. I tried it up on the east side, I went up on the west. You can take all of New York, cause I know what is best. Gotta get out of New York City, back to a place where I belong. Gotta get back to the city, back to the city. Gotta get back to the city. Gotta get back to the city. Gotta get back to the city. Back to sensitive part now. I'm ready to get back into it now. You can take me to San Francisco. I've seen the Golden Gate, but I don't want to stay there, and I don't want to be late. Gotta make my plane for Chicago. Get back to a place where I belong. Gotta get back to the city. 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 Back to Chicago where I belong.
There's another story that I like. It's the 355 story. Okay. You got to tell me this story about, and if people don't know what the 355, tell the whole.
Well, again, 355 guitars are, the body style is a Gibson body style initially, and it's called a semi-hollow. So what happens is it has some holes in it, so you can hear it when you play it, okay? And it gives a kind of depth to your playing. It's very popular. A guitar that's semi-hollow is very popular in jazz and blues and even rock and roll music. Well, the 355 is one that actually most people are familiar with, how B.B. King's guitar. So it's very much like B.B. King's, but before B.B. got his own private label one. So anyway, to make a long story short, I had a similar one when I was in 7th grade, because I used to work cleaning counters in a music store, and he gave me like the musician's price, even though I was 14 years old. So I had a great guitar when I was 14, and without going into detail, one of my friends ran over it with his car when I was 20 years old.
Oh my God.
And at that point, I was married and I had a kid on the way, and I couldn't afford to replace it. Fast forward, every time I had money, I couldn't find one, because Gibson had gone through some changes, as they are now, and the necks were different than the ones I liked. So anyway, I had dragged my friend Ray along with me, and to all the New York music stores, Manny's and Sam Ash and all those things over there, and I never could find one that I could afford that was in the right condition. So after I moved back to Chicago, he finds one on consignment at actually Fairfield Music, which is owned by another great Connecticut musician originally, Al Ferrante, and he calls my house to talk to me about it, and anyway, gets my wife, and my wife buys it sight unseen. To this day, I've never really asked her what she paid for it, and wraps it up and gives it to me for Christmas. Okay, like a train set. Now, as soon as I open it up, it's in walnut, which, to my understanding, never had the little neck that I was looking for. But I thought, oh, this woman loves me so much. It was probably $4,000 or $5,000 back then, and I'm never gonna not play this, even though it's not what I was looking for. And when I finally put my hands on the guitar, it was like a guitar that, it was like finding a body part. It really was. And fast forward, I broke the damn thing twice.
Really?
Yeah. And right after I got it rehabilitated, it fell, I broke the neck. I had it repaired. I literally tossed it out the van, broke it again, late at night in a rainstorm. So then I took B.B. King's example, and I put my wife's name on the headstock, and it's been beautiful ever since.
And
So
you're still playing it?
Cheryl Lynn, that's my favorite guitar, and I take that wherever I go.
Oh, that's a great story.
Yeah.
Now, what would you hope others would learn from your accomplishments?
Well, I hope that, I was fortunate enough to experience, blues is not as big as rock and roll, but I experienced the thrill of playing big crowds in really wonderful places, in Ecuador, in Guayaquil with the ocean over there. And it started with me going to jam sessions, and like many part-time guitar players do, all over the country every night. And it's very difficult for those of us to do that because you go there and not every experience is beautiful, you know. But I always tell people to hang on and play the music that you like, and every once in a while you get a break. So my break led me to I had 10 years of really great experiences, and you know, I encourage everyone else. I still go to jam sessions, and I do it because there's a certain immediacy there that you can't get anywhere else, and there's always a chance. You know, so I guess it's hope, you know, just keep on hoping and study your stuff, you know, because blues music is very simple and when you look into it, but it's very difficult to play genuinely, and so that when you start playing, all of a sudden everything comes together, which is my goal.
Well, one of the things that I admire about you is that you really took the time to go and analyze players, physically go and watch them play live,
Right.
and then through your admiration for their craft, you learned and then asked a lot of questions.
Yes, Marcel, that's really correct, yes.
You know, you must have also built some really wonderful friendships.
I did, but you know, when I was a youngster, I was pretty timid, so I didn't always have a personal exchange, you know what I mean, other than, hi, I really like your playing. But the one thing that I always tell people is music, and I don't care if you went to Berkeley to study your music, or if you learned like I did in garages and basements, and all my formal music lessons were to try to educate me for my next job. You know, if I had a job where it was more jazz oriented, I would go. But the real important thing is it's like talking. You can't get a good vocabulary unless you listen to other people, you know, speak, unless you read more, okay? That's how you develop your vocabulary. Well, how you develop your music vocabulary, especially for soloing, is, first of all, you can't solo without a vocabulary, okay? Because you have nothing to say, okay? Secondly, you can't solo or be unique without something from the heart that's behind those words. You know, it's like anything, you know, we read or we see people on TV that are talking heads, and then some people with so few words move us and make us go right down to the core. And that's where I really tell people, you know, study, pay attention to people, and absorb as much you can.
Well, Tom,
Yeah.
I love you. You are
Thank you, Marcel.
fabulous.
Love you too. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, one thing that you have to understand when you're watching my program and I bring these people to you is there's many, many pieces of information that they bestow on you. This gentleman took his love and passion for Chicago blues, where he grew up, raised a family, took on responsibilities for everything that he had to do, but at the same time, every single opportunity he had, he took and he studied and he honed his craft and became a fabulous, fabulous guitar player, a fabulous gentleman. So until the next time, let's talk.